Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Anna Sophia Lahovary, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our guests. If you're a student and would like to join, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop hearing system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able to, and just ask one brief question. If you are part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please raise your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming Director Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Anna Sophia. So great to see you all. It's such a beautiful fall day here in Lawrence, Kansas, and I hope you all had a restful fall break. We are so excited. We've been waiting for literally months and months to host our guest this afternoon, Myra Gutin. We are so pleased to have you here to present 10 defining moments in the history of the American First Lady from 1900 to 2023. Before I give you any more details, I want to be sure and invite you to the Dole Institute on October 24th, coming up next Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. We're going to welcome Wall Street Journal's own Jerry Seib, who's a former fellow of ours. He'll be inviting his friends, Celinda Lake and Ed Goaz, who are Democratic and Republican pollsters, respectively, for a poll out of Georgetown for many decades. And they will be discussing their book, A Question of Respect. You can purchase the book before the program, and if you would like for one of them to sign that book. And so now it's my pleasure to tell you more about Myra Gutin. She is Professor Emeritus of Communication at Rider University. Emerita, I do know my Latin. Okay. For the past 40 years, her research has focused on American First Ladies. She wrote a book on Barbara Bush and is currently working on a biography of Betty Ford. A frequent media commentator, she is the president of FLAIR, the First Ladies Association for Research and Education. And of course, many of you know and love our own Diana Carlin, who hosted our presidential lecture series earlier this year. She is a professor emerita of communication at St. Louis University and a retired professor of communication studies here at KU, where she taught a course on women in politics that included First Ladies, and she's the co-author of the first ever textbook on First Ladies, which was just released this year, U.S. First Ladies, Making History and Leaving Legacies, that was just released for publications. This is history-making scholarship right here, and we're so fortunate that we had a group of students here at the Institute and at the Honors Program in KU to work with Diana to help her develop this content. How innovative to work with students to make sure that this book really speaks to their interests and covers all bases. So congratulations, Diana. It's really exciting. If you would all please join me in welcoming Diana and Myra this afternoon.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Audrey. Myra was supposed to be part of the presidential lecture series and then had a family emergency last March. So I filled in for her on Betty Ford along with Bob yes, who was here talking about Pat Nixon, and we talked about a few other First Ladies. So I am thrilled you're here, and Audrey and Sarah and everyone. I also Barbie, I want to thank you for finding the students for us to test out a preliminary version of the book. And we have a public version coming out before December, and there's a flyer about it. It's very little different from the textbook, obviously. You don't have to answer questions at the end of every chapter or one thing. But Myra, we're thrilled to have you here, and I'm so glad we worked out. We were a little worried that we were competing with a gorgeous October day, so thank you all for giving up an hour and so of this great weather. So Myra, as Audrey said in the introduction, you have been working on First Ladies, you told us, since you were 40 years ago. And Myra really is one of the pioneers in a field that we now call First Lady Studies. There's presidential studies, and occasionally somebody would do something with First Ladies. But in 1982, Lewis Gould, who is a distinguished emeritus professor at the University of Texas, became interested in First Ladies because of the Johnson Library. And he began offering a course in 1982. It was the first ever course on First Ladies. And 2 years later, he published a book through the University Press of Kansas on Lady Bird Johnson and the environment. And it's the only book that's ever been written about a First Lady and a single issue. And that was the start then of a series that is ongoing with the University Press of Kansas. It's the only series on First Ladies. And Myra and I have both written in some of those books. And, so KU has had a lot to do with this kind of new field. But Myra is really one of the pioneers. Her dissertation was there. She was in Grand Rapids 40 years ago when Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter came together and hosted the first ever conference on First Ladies. And we're going to be at the Central States Communication Association for the 40th anniversary in Grand Rapids, and we'll be having a panel looking at what's happened the last 40 years. So Myra, how did you get started in all of this? What got you interested in First Ladies?
Well, I always had an interest in First Ladies. I was telling Diana, I will always get teased about this. I was raised in the Eleanor Roosevelt Shrine. My mother was a great admirer of Mrs. Roosevelt. She always felt that this was a woman who showed what other women could do. So when the time rolled around for me to write my doctoral dissertation at the University of Michigan, I thought that I would write about Mrs. Roosevelt. And I prepared the prospectus for it. I was all set to go, and my dissertation advisor said to me, I think you would do better if you did something that compared First Ladies. And in my enthusiasm and idiocy, I said, great, I'm going to do every First Lady, beginning with Florence Harding, First Lady after suffrage, all the way up to where I was. At that point, it was 1980, 70-something. At any rate, Nancy Reagan was the First Lady. And I thought it would take 1.5 years, and it took 5 years. Right after that, I finished. I thought, okay, I'm going to go back to teaching communication courses. And I got a call from a reporter who said, I'd like to ask you some questions about the current First Lady. And my career was born. It's never gone away. As Diana can tell you, it gets much busier during a presidential year, but it's been fascinating, and I've had some wonderful experiences over the course of it.
Yeah, Myra has been on the C-SPAN series that Susan Swain did back in 2014, and she's interviewed all the time by the Associated Press, and she is the president, as Audrey said, of our association, one of the founders. So we're really fortunate to have somebody here who was literally at the beginning of this whole area of study. So with that said, we were talking last night, we could probably have 30 or 40 defining moments, but lists of 10 are pretty popular, as late night television has made them. So these are the First Ladies that we're going to be talking about from 1919, 1923. So let's start with 1919. War is over. And we had a First Lady who, if some of you were here last February, when Rebecca Roberts was part of my program, and her book on Edith Wilson was about to come out called Untold Power. And some people have said that Edith Wilson was our first and only woman president. So Edith Bowling Galt Wilson, there's her photo up there. Yes. For those in the audience who were here, you probably know a little bit about this, but tell us why Edith was the defining moment.
Well, the year that this all comes to light really is 1919. World War I has ended. Woodrow Wilson wants the United States to join the League of Nations, He seems to have great success in Europe, comes back to the United States, gets to the United States Senate, and hits a stone wall. So he says to Edith, we're going to go on a train trip around the United States. It was called a swing around the circle. And I'm going to persuade people that this is the right thing. They will talk to their legislators and we'll get this passed. Not quite. Mr. Wilson exerted himself terribly. During this continuous train trip, he collapsed in Colorado. He had a stroke, and it was actually a minor stroke, but by the time they got him to the train to go home, he had had a second major stroke. I don't think to this day we realize how debilitated he was, but Edith definitely did, and so did his doctors. And his doctors said, well, Mrs. Wilson, the president needs total rest and no stress. Right, the president of the United States, no stress. Well, she took him back to the White House and she said to everyone, I will talk to the president. You will not go into his room. His doctors could go in, and a few very, very trusted aides. She said, but otherwise no one goes in. So that's where the rumor started, because people said that Wilson was so debilitated that it was Edith who was taking the papers that were brought every day from the Senate or the House, and she was making the decisions. And some of the answers they found to be really strange and convoluted. At a certain point, a delegation of senators said, we will not put up with this anymore, Mrs. Wilson. We want to see that the president is well. So she knew how debilitated he was, so she got his aide to dress him up, and I believe he was paralyzed on the left. So she had him sit at a window in the White House, his paralyzed side away from the window, and she had him waving with his right hand to people below. So the senator said, okay, he's really not that bad. The historian Arthur Link, who has done a great deal of work on Wilson, has said, and I completely agree, and I think Rebecca Roberts, who wrote the biography, pretty much agree on the fact that she was not the first female president. She was the gatekeeper, and she controlled the access. And that, at least in 1919, was tantamount to total power. And Diana and I were talking about the fact last night that the 25th Amendment did not yet exist, which would then have allowed for the vice president to take over Mr. Wilson's responsibilities.
Okay. Edith Wilson.
Edith Wilson.
So let's fast forward 10 years to a first lady who was a trailblazer, and I don't believe has gotten the credit that she really deserves. She was born in our nearby state of Iowa, Henry Hoover. And this was a time when Jim Crow was rampant in the South. There was a lot of lynching going on. Presidential politics related to race in both parties was pretty tenuous. No one was really sure how to deal with things. We only had one black congressman from Illinois, Oscar DePriest. He was the first one since Reconstruction, was from Illinois. And so this is kind of the context, and you have Henry Hoover. And the Hoovers were known for being very much open in terms of civil rights. They moved into a neighborhood in D.C., and it had restricted covenants, and they were supposed to sign it, and they refused to do it. Just said, we will not have anything to do with signing anything related to restricted covenants. So they had a background in this way. So Lou does something that seems like it should be relatively simple, normal, but it turns out to be fairly controversial. Tell us about Lou and the woman on the other side of her.
It's 1929. The Hoovers are in the White House. And one thing that the First Lady did then, she still does, is to have over the wives of congressmen and senators for tea. Seems simple enough. Well, the wife of Representative DePriest, Jessie DePriest, she's on the right there, was invited. She was a woman of color, And there were great worries about how she was going to be treated. Mrs. Hoover was told that she should not invite her. She absolutely rejected that. She said she's the wife of a congressperson, she's going to come. She was also smart, though, Lou Hoover. She spoke to the other women who were going to be coming with Mrs. DePriest. Everyone was fine with it. Mrs. DePriest comes to tea, everyone has a good time, and it seems everything is okay until she leaves the White House. I know Diana has done this, some of our colleagues have. Some of the mail that I read that was sent to Mrs. Hoover is among the nastiest, most disheartening that I've ever read. Starting with one that will always stay in my mind. One woman wrote and said, well, Mrs. Hoover, now that the DePriest Tea Party has been held, we cannot call it the White House anymore, can we? That was only the tip of the iceberg. Mrs. Hoover was censured by the state legislatures of Texas and Florida. Her life was threatened. Now, President Hoover, for his part, decided that he was going to try to calm the waters. He invited Booker T. Washington to come to lunch. And he wrote in his biography, therefore, the White House was defiled twice during my presidency. Over time, things settled down, but it did certainly give us some idea of how the issue of race was actually going to play out for the First Lady and plays out not very long after for Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yeah. Well, and then President Hoover also reinforced the decision by also inviting some of the presidents of the historically black
That's
colleges and universities to the White House. So he was standing firm, and you have to admire the Hoovers. And I think this is one of those things that they don't necessarily get credit for. We think about the Hoovers and the Depression. And Lou Henry is an incredible woman, first woman to graduate from Stanford with a degree in geology. And she did an amazing number of things, and so we're hoping she gets her due a little bit more. All right, so as we're both communication scholars, First Lady's Studies is interdisciplinary. I see Bill Tuttle here. We have American Studies professors, we have history, we have political science, we have women's studies, we have communication, we have journalists. So it really is an incredibly interdisciplinary area. But you and I tend to frame our research with communication as the basis. And we look a lot at the strategies that First Ladies use to accomplish their goals. So there are three First Ladies that we're going to show up here, Eleanor Roosevelt, Jackie Kennedy, and Michelle Obama, three very distinct eras of our history. And you believe that they're defining because they stand out for some innovations. So will you tell us about those innovations?
Well, Eleanor Roosevelt becomes the first Lady to use radio regularly. Now, to be absolutely historically accurate, she was not the first. Lou Hoover was. Lou Hoover gave speeches on the radio during the Depression. If any of the women in the audience have been Girl Scouts at some point in time, Mrs. Hoover was the national president of the Girl Scouts at one point, and she spoke about that on the radio, and she said to the Girl Scouts out there, you can help your neighbors during the Depression, you can do any number of things, and she described it. So she did use the radio, but Eleanor Roosevelt used it for different series, commercial series that she did on the radio. And any money that she received was given to charity, and she used it very effectively. I believe it was in 1939 she was named the First Lady of Radio. So she really had a well-defined sense of what media could do. Jacqueline Kennedy is later acknowledged as the First Lady of television. And much of that owes to the televised tour of the White House that she did in 1962. I see some people are shaking their heads. I watched it too, even though I'd like not to admit it, but I did. And one thing that always makes me smile about it is when I teach about it and I show the program to my students, somebody raises his hand and says, "How come it's in black and white?" And I say, well, it was 1962, and color in television nighttime broadcast doesn't really begin until 1965. At any rate, Jacqueline Kennedy used television very effectively for this purpose. She also becomes the first lady to appoint a press secretary. She appoints a young woman named Pamela Turner to serve her, and her advice to Pamela Turner, this will tell you something about Jacqueline Kennedy and how she felt about the media. She said, "Tell them what you have to, keep them away from me." Okay.
But do it politely.
Do it politely. That's right. That's right. That's right. She did say do it politely. But she was a great success, and some of you, if you are of my vintage, or perhaps you found this in a dusty corner in a cabinet somewhere, may recall a record album of the time called The First Family, which was Vaughn Meader, who was imitating John Kennedy and the rest of the family, and one of the cuts on the album is called The Tour, which is supposed to be about the White House tour, and I just remember, it still makes me laugh. Supposedly Charles Kuralt, who was interviewing her for as part of the tour, says to her, "So Mrs. Kennedy, let's go into this room, show me some paintings." And they do, and then they have the actress who's playing Mrs. Kennedy in a very breathy voice say, "Well, there's that one, and there's that one, and there's that one there." It was a terrific success. It sold millions of copies. By the way, you can find it online and hear, if not the whole album, you can hear cuts. It's worth it. It's still a lot of fun to listen to.
Yeah, before you get to
Sure.
Michelle Obama, you mentioned the title of it was The First Family.
That's correct.
That's significant. You want to explain why?
It's the first time that term was used
Yeah.
with the Kennedys, the first family. Yeah, thank you for reminding me
Yeah,
of that,
yeah.
yes.
Okay, Michelle
Okay,
Obama.
so Michelle Obama, we jump ahead to 2009. She becomes the first lady to extensively use social media. She felt that she wanted her message to go directly to the people. She didn't want to talk to reporters, which they didn't appreciate, but she felt it was her particular focus. So she used social media. And she also was showing up fairly frequently on television. You would have seen her on Sesame Street. You would have seen her on Ellen's talk show. You might have seen her on The View. You might have seen her on Nashville. You might have seen her during one of the Academy Award broadcasts. So she used media extensively. All three of them did.
Okay. Well, we talked about the step that Henry Hoover took in terms of civil rights, but her successor, Eleanor Roosevelt, was really known to be a civil rights leader. She was very active with the NAACP. She attended various conferences of all of the black organizations. She was way ahead of her husband in this respect, and she had a bounty of $25,000 on her head by the Ku Klux Klan because of her activities. But her defining moment is 1939 with Marian Anderson. So tell us about that one.
Yes, so Marian Anderson was a mezzo-soprano with the Metropolitan Opera in New York. She had actually been invited to the White House by President Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt in 1936 to entertain them. In 1939, she was supposed to give a recital at Constitution Hall in Washington. And I'm not clear if it was 2 or 3 weeks before, but her manager received notification that she could not appear, that the hall was double booked. Washington was a segregated city in 1939, it became clear that the president of the Daughters of the American Revolution, who were the owners of Constitution Hall, had said that no black artist would appear there. I also mentioned this to Diana last night. This really did happen to me. I was speaking at Rutgers University a few years ago, and I told the story, same story that I've just told you, and a woman was sitting in the back, and she raised her hand, and she stood up, and she said to me, "Dr. Gutin, you are wrong." And I said, "Okay, please tell me where I've erred." And she said, "Well, I'm a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and that hall was double booked." And I said, "Okay, I thank you for that information. Would you be kind enough to send me some documentation? And if you do, I'll change my book, and I will circulate this to other historians, because this has been sort of an accepted belief." And she said, "Well, I'll do that." And I said, "Okay." I have yet to receive that letter. Haven't seen it. Unfortunately, it was a very unfortunate incident. Now, Mrs. Roosevelt heard about it, and in her column, My Day, she wrote and she said, "If I had the chance to, and in the past, if I've been in an organization and I didn't agree with their policies, then I tried to change things from the inside. But in my current position, I can't do that. Therefore, I resign." So Mrs. Roosevelt left the DAR, but then she and Harold Ickes, who was the Secretary of the Interior, decided they were going to try to find another place for Marian Anderson to sing. And they did, and it was the Lincoln Memorial, as you can see, and on Easter morning of 1939, Miss Anderson gave her recital. And I encourage you to go online and to watch that particular moment when Miss Anderson starts the recital singing "My Country 'Tis of Thee." If it doesn't bring you to tears, I'll be very surprised. It's a very, very moving moment.
Yeah. There's 75,000 people, and you can see the video, and it is an incredibly diverse audience. I showed it. I'm teaching a virtual class with my new book at American University, because that's where one of my co-authors is. And I showed it to my students, and I don't think any of us had a dry eye, and I've seen it countless times. It is, just go to YouTube, and I agree with Myra,
Right.
you really need to watch it. It's amazing. So you mentioned a few minutes ago about Jackie's tour, and she got an honorary Emmy for it, only First Lady who's had an honorary Emmy. And as you said, a lot of us are old enough to remember that. I actually dreamt about Abraham Lincoln walking into my bedroom after they talked about the Lincoln bedroom that night. You know, little kids have responses to these things. So in addition to her using this medium to talk about restoration, what else was significant about what she did with the White House?
Well, it's 1962 when Mrs. Kennedy had been given her tour of the White House after JFK won the presidency. She was given there's a standard tour that the outgoing First Lady gives to the incoming. Mamie Eisenhower gave Jacqueline Kennedy the tour, and later Mrs. Kennedy, I'm going to try and remember the quote, she said, "The White House looked like it had been decorated with secondhand furniture purchased in Grand Rapids." It was not very generous. She said she felt that the White House should exhibit the best in America, it should have the best, and she was going to do her best to try and do that. So she founded the White House Committee on the Fine Arts, and was given a small stipend by Congress. I think it was $100,000. But almost everything that came to the White House was by public donation. There was some public fundraising that went on. And the tour of the White House was to show people the results of what she had been able to accomplish. Something that grew out of this was the White House Historical Association, which continues to be just a leader in all things White House. Mrs. Kennedy was also responsible behind, actually, we'll say, legislation that made the White House a museum. Up until this time, I remember when I was doing this research, I learned this. If you were the president and you were leaving the White House and you wanted to take some furniture with you, you could. And they did. No more. That just does not happen. So the White House today it's a house, it's a home, but it's also a living museum. Also, the significance of this moment is that Mrs. Kennedy's project of the refurbishment of the White House is the first major First Lady project, and no First Lady going forward, save for Betty Ford, who was only in the White House for 2.5 years, would have a project. Everyone had some focus while they were at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
And her successor, Lady Bird Johnson, who, unlike Jackie hated politics. She wanted absolutely nothing to do with it, which is why she had some of the advice to the press. She stayed out of it as much as she could. Lady Bird, like I said, known for her environment. They called it beautification, which she hated that term. But Lady Bird, in addition to the environment, did something else that no other First Lady had done.
That's right. Lady Bird Johnson was a very adroit politician in her own right. It was 1964. The Civil Rights Act had been passed, and Lyndon Johnson was getting unbelievable grief from the South. They felt that he was a traitor. And he and Lady Bird thought just the opposite. They thought that the time had come. It was time for equal rights. So Lady Bird said to her press secretary and staff director, a woman named Liz Carpenter, that she wanted to go on a tour through the South, a campaign through the South. And they put together this tour. They were on a train. This was actually in the back of the train. And it was called the Lady Bird Special. From October 6th to 9th, 1964, I think it was 1,726 miles, 47 speeches over 4 days. Mrs. Johnson spoke to the people of this country about the Equal Rights Amendment. Things were good from Virginia to South Carolina. Then they started to get pretty ugly. The Ku Klux Klan said they were going to blow up her train. Her life was threatened. They saw signs when they went places that said, "Lady Bird, fly away." And Lady Bird Johnson was undeterred. She said to the people on the train who had said to her initially, "You really shouldn't do this," she said, "We must go. We must let them know that we care about them, but they also have to know that this is going to be the law of the land." And it was a very successful tour through the South. They went through 8 states. They carried 3 of 8. I asked Liz Carpenter about that, and she said, when you consider the opposition that we were up against, winning those 3 states was a major accomplishment.
Yeah. And they ran, because of the threats, they ran an engine ahead of her train so that if there was anything going on, this engine would get hit instead of Lady Bird. She also brought 250 members of the press with her.
That's right.
So she created her own press moments, and it was one of the savviest. And ever since then, wives have had their own campaigns and are still doing it.
But never quite as dramatic as,
No.
as this
Yeah,
trip.
this truly
which
was.
really something special.
And didn't Lyndon join her at the last stop?
He did. He met her in New Orleans, and he gave a speech, and that was the end of the Lady Bird special, but not the effect.
Well, let's shift away from politics to some of the personal things. You know, one of the things that we've all tried to do, both with the presidential lecture series and those of us who write about First Ladies, is to humanize them. Because these are people who are living their lives, they're raising families, they're dealing with personal issues, deaths of children, deaths of family members. And in the 19th and early 20th century, we had quite a few First Ladies who had very ill health and didn't do a whole lot. Several of them hardly ever left their bedrooms while they were in the White House, and they had daughters or cousins or nieces or somebody or daughters-in-law do all the work. And most of these women, no one knew exactly what was wrong with them. They kept things under wraps. And then we had Betty Ford.
Right. There she is.
And about 6 weeks after she entered the White House, she got a very devastating piece of news.
She did. She went to Bethesda National Medical Center for a regular exam. It was found that she had a lump in her breast. It turned out to be cancerous. And 2 days later, she had a radical mastectomy. She had decided right from the moment of the diagnosis that she was going to go public with it. I was really very fortunate to have the chance to meet her, to interview her, and she said something to me that she also said on 60 Minutes a year later, and she said, my feeling was if I had it, other women had it. If I said nothing, their lives would be gone. And it was such a precedent-shattering way for a first lady to deal with illness. And it was cancer, which wasn't even spoken about at that time. I remember my mother-in-law talking about the big C behind her hand. You know, you didn't even say it out loud. And you certainly didn't say the word breast. But Mrs. Ford most definitely did. Because of her, the American Cancer Society was noted an increase of 1,000% in requests for information about breast health. Mammography was new, and there were, I'm sure, many, many unfulfilled requests because the equipment was not quite keeping up yet with the demand. Mrs. Ford gave speeches. I read so much of the correspondence that she received. People wrote to her and thanked her because they did believe that she had saved their lives, because she had talked about breast self-examination and how you shouldn't just fool around with it, how you should see a physician. So that was really a defining moment. Now, I've also included one other picture on the slide. That's Betty Ford in 1983, when the Betty Ford Center was dedicated. And the center was dedicated to deal with chemical dependency. This was when Betty Ford admitted she was an alcoholic, and she was addicted to prescription pills. She had gone through rehab, she was clean, she was free, and the center was set up. And in about 2 years, please read my book, and you can read the whole story. But until then, just keep in mind that in large part, her success, I will always believe, was because of her openness about breast cancer and sharing that with America.
Well, very close to the president's office, one of the lives she saved was the vice president's wife.
That's right. Happy Rockefeller, the wife of the vice president at the time, also found that she had a lump in her breast. And then also, a few years later, Nancy Reagan.
Yes.
And guess who Nancy Reagan first called when she found out that she had it? She called Betty Ford to find out how she had dealt with the media and the public at the time of her diagnosis.
And Nancy Reagan did something very bold, too. She had a mastectomy. And this was at a point when there were more lumpectomies and they were not doing the radical. And she said, I don't have time for chemotherapy. I have a busy schedule. And there were doctors who were criticizing her. He said, women need to make their own health decisions. And no one is to criticize them. No one knows what they're going through except them. And so she kind of took Betty Ford's position a little farther. And I'll put a plug in for Flair. Last October, during Breast Cancer Month, we do regular, most of the time monthly, Flair virtual programs about First Ladies. And you can just go to First Ladies Association for Research and Education, Flair. But that program is on our YouTube channel. And Nancy Brinker, who started the Susan G. Komen Foundation, does the intro and talks about Betty Ford and Nancy Reagan's influence. And we have a really lively discussion about that for Breast Cancer Month. So very important, two very important things that Betty Ford did.
Yes.
So Betty was an activist on a lot of levels. She supported the ERA. In fact, she had to put a private phone line in the White House so that she wasn't using a public phone to call state legislators to encourage them to vote for the ERA. She also was very open about abortion rights, as was Pat Nixon, which surprises a lot of people, and she also supported the ERA. And she gave her opinion on a lot of topics, including her daughter's premarital sex on that 60 Minutes program. But she was followed by another First Lady who had a long-time political marriage and also was had a partnership, and that was Rosalind Carter.
Rosalind Carter, yeah.
So, we really see her as moving the position forward too. And so in what ways did she do it?
Well, two interesting things about her, two interesting First Lady firsts. Every Tuesday, I believe, that she was in Washington, she and the president had a working lunch. And I mention that because it wasn't just chit-chat about how are the kids and what's going on. These were substantive talks about what was going on in the president's office. And then Rosalind Carter was attending cabinet meetings. She never spoke, she took notes. And she came in for a lot of criticism. There were questions about accountability. Who appointed her? What is she doing there? But her response was to say, I go out and I do a lot of speeches. I talk to a lot of people. This is my way to become informed. In 1977 or 78, the president either asked her or she volunteered, it seems like history is not quite clear, if she would go to Central and South America on a tour which was seen as at the consular level, which means that she had been given fiat to talk about substantive topics. And some of those topics were getting international loans, the arms buildup, interdicting the drug trade, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, not the things that a First Lady usually talks about. And this did not play well, with most of the male politicians in South America who felt that she just shouldn't be doing it. They thought that this was just supposed to be a dress-up tea party. Well, it wasn't. And she did very well. She came away with some very positive reviews for having represented the president well. And Diana reminded me last night, she wasn't the First Lady to do this. The First Lady was really, again, maybe a surprise, Pat Nixon, who had been sent to talk to 2 parliaments in Africa and to tour Africa. The difference is, though, that the Nixon administration, particularly through some of the people who worked for the president at that time, pushed her aside, and she really never got any kind of credit for it. There was not anything really in the press. Very much unlike Rosalind Carter, whose husband was very much in favor of her doing this and cheered her efforts. So that was why I put her in with this very special group.
And she also had the mental health. She did for mental health a lot of what Betty Ford had done for breast cancer, bringing it out in the public, running around the country. Right. She was the honorary chair of that commission and got some legislation passed as a result.
Yes, she did.
Appeared before Congress. She was the first since Eleanor. Eleanor was the first to appear before a congressional committee, and then Betty Ford was next. Which brings us to another First Lady who appeared before Congress, and we're up now to number 9 of your 10, Hillary Clinton. And she did something, well, she actually did a lot of some things that no other First Lady had done. But what do you consider her major milestone?
Well, my particular focus for her was her decision to run for the Senate in 2000. And I think the moment she made the decision, and I think some of you will remember this, was when she found out about Monica Lewinsky. And I say that because I think that she felt at that point, well, Bill, you've had your shot, I'm going to take mine. That's really the way I think about it, and I have to confess, I've always wanted to have been a fly on the wall when he told her, honey, there's this story in the Washington Post this morning, maybe we should discuss it. But she did make the decision, and she went on a listening tour. She was going to run for the seat held in New York by Daniel Patrick Moynihan. She went to, I think, most of the counties in New York. She got a very positive response, and she ran for and was elected to the Senate. And seemed to serve with distinction, was able to work with her colleagues across the aisle. I know that it was a surprise to many that she did as well in the Senate as she did, but she was good. By the way, I have to just throw something in. We didn't talk about this, but I am not a very good prognosticator. I got a call a few days after the idea had started to float that she was going to run for the Senate. And someone from Newsday called me and he said, "Do you think she's going to run for Senate?" And I said, "She'll never run." I said, "No, there's no chance. She won't want to be in the Senate under Trent Lott, and she doesn't like the media, and Chelsea is still young. No, she'll never run." And 2 days later, he said, "I thought I'd call you to let you know that she set up an exploratory committee." And I said,
So,
"Don't believe me." Not
we
about that.
never know.
Not about that. Yeah.
All right, number 10 on your list is related to the historic election of Barack Obama.
Right.
And that meant we also had a historic First Lady. And
Yes.
so let's talk about Michelle Obama's
Michelle
historic
Obama, yeah, there
First
she is.
Ladyship.
Yeah. Well, as the first woman of color to serve as First Lady, Mrs. Obama had more challenges than some of her predecessors. Just to share a quick personal anecdote, during the election of 2008, I had been called by a radio station in New York, and it was a call-in program, and a woman called, and she said to me, "Well, do you think that Michelle Obama is up to being First Lady?" And I said, "Well, okay, let's see. She graduated from Princeton. She graduated from Harvard Law School. She was an associate at a major Chicago law firm. She was an assistant to the mayor of Chicago. She was vice president of University of Chicago Hospitals. Yeah, I think she can do it. I really do." Unfortunately, again, if you followed some of the civil rights points that we've been discussing this afternoon, unfortunately, Mrs. Obama had to deal with the same things. Even before Obama was elected president, there were death threats. They had to ramp up her security. She didn't, at least early on, get as many invitations as some other first ladies have gotten. I think many people had trouble with the fact that she was not a white woman. It was what we had come to expect in the job. During the 2012 election, I was back on another radio show, and a woman called, and she said she was just scandalized by the fact that Mrs. Obama would exercise in the White House, and how could she run around wearing sleeveless shifts? How could she do that? And I said, well, first of all, Barbara Bush seemed to exercise an awful lot in the White House, and if I had arms like that, I'd not wear sleeves either, so let's just sort of forget that. She has been tremendously successful. Her autobiography, when it was published, I think holds the record for the greatest, it's been a phenomenal success. Mm-hmm. And she's written another book. She has a children's show. She's involved in many, many different educational ventures. She's really been quite a success.
And she started a nonprofit company making healthy drinks for kids. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember the name of it. Anyway, it has a weird name. But First Lady, who post-White House, has started a business of that type.
Yeah.
I think pretty amazing. In 2016, as the outgoing First Lady, she also spoke at the Democratic Convention, and she made the comment that every morning for 8 years, she woke up in a house that had been built by slave labor. And this was a surprise to people at the White House Historical Association.
Yeah.
And they started a project, and I really encourage you to go on the White House Historical Association website, called Slavery in the President's Neighborhood. And that speech of Michelle Obama's really awakened people to what had gone on with the building of the White House, with the fact that we had 10 families that brought their enslaved servants to the White House, and they did it as a cost-saving measure, because Congress didn't give enough money. So if they brought their own enslaved workers, they could have enough people to run the White House. But these things had never been discussed before, and if Michelle Obama had not made that comment in that speech. So it was really a defining moment for the White House Historical Association.
That's right.
And this is ongoing research, and it's an excellent section of their website. So we've done our 10, but I think we have another minute, so let's go for bonus number 11.
We have a bonus.
So what would be on your bonus list?
Well, I would say it's Dr. Jill Biden, and we'll see her picture, I think, in a minute. So there she is, Dr. Biden. She is the first lady to have continuous employment outside the White House. Just again, to put the historical record completely straight, remember Eleanor Roosevelt did those lectures, the radio series. She did lectures too, but they were not continuous. They were, really more periodic than anything. Jill Biden has been teaching for a long time. She taught as second lady. She's teaching as first lady. I think she's really given a boost to women who are wondering, can you have it all? Can you actually work? Can you do this? Can you do that? And she's managing to pull it off. Again, another first lady first.
So we're going to go to questions. If you have any, those of you who are watching virtually, it's dolequestions@ku.edu. And I believe we have a couple people with microphones. Well, they're getting up. Myra, any last thoughts before we go to the audience questions?
Well, I've been studying First Ladies now for over 40 years, and my feeling is whether you like them or not, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, you've got to admire what it's like to be in that position in the White House, because it's a tough one. And whether you did like them or not, I think that you should be proud of them, because they've all served us very well.
Okay. All right. Your questions, comments. I've got one up here in the front. Wait till we get the mic.
I wondered what you thought of the Mrs. Bushes.
Oh, the two Mrs. Bushes.
Oh, the two Mrs. Bushes. Well, I wrote a biography of one of them, so. Well, they're different. Barbara Bush, very much a political wife for a long time. And by the way, I'm wearing my Barbara Bush pearls. I hope you see this. My husband gave me these when I finished my book. Came into the White House with the idea that she wanted very much to continue a project that she'd started years before for literacy. And because of her, we now have the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy. They give out grants every year to organizations all over the country that are encouraging literacy. I think she did a great deal for that. Both she and President Bush did a great deal for childhood cancer. Diana referred early on today to the fact that, the people in the White House, they're families, and unfortunately, they have the same tragedies and happinesses that all of us do, but they also had, the Bushes, the terrible experience of losing a young child to leukemia. When Robin was about four years old. They took her to Sloan Kettering in New York, and they tried to save her, and she passed away. And after that, and Mrs. Bush did this without any kind of publicity, wherever they were, she was active in the Children's Hospital, and particularly in trying to combat childhood cancer. So she did a great deal of good. She was followed, a few years later into the White House by her daughter-in-law, Laura Bush, and I always got a great kick out of this. Some of you may watch the White House Press Correspondents' Dinner, and I remember one year Laura Bush got up and she said something about, if you win first prize, you get 1 week with the Bush family in Kennebunkport, Maine. If you get second place, you get 2 weeks with the with the Bush family. If you get third place, you get 3 weeks with the family. But Laura Bush also very much involved in literacy. She was behind what is now the Washington Book Festival on the Mall in Washington. Very much a strong proponent of education. She was a librarian. Very involved in the cause of Afghan women,
Yes.
which we've talked about a lot. So they were both, I think, people who did a lot of public good, but a lot of it they did quietly. And that was just their way. But yeah, they also both leave a legacy that's really something to be very proud of.
Yeah, I think the other thing Barbara Bush doesn't get enough credit for is what she did with AIDS. AIDS came to be known during the Reagan administration, and given all their Hollywood contacts, they didn't do a whole lot until Rock Hudson died. And when their son, who was Ron Jr., was dancing on Broadway and was bringing it, so they began toward the end putting a commission together. But Barbara Bush is the one who really sensitized us to needing to understand the disease. She went to an orphanage for AIDS children whose mothers had most likely had died of AIDS, and they had fetal AIDS. And she picked up a little boy and held him. And this was when everybody thought if you got within 10 feet of somebody with AIDS, you were going to get it and die. And she is cuddling this baby. And Princess Diana did something later, but Barbara Bush did that. And that picture was worth, more than 1,000 words. And then when Ryan White was infected through a blood transfusion and wasn't allowed to go to school, Barbara Bush took that on. They went to his funeral. And then she got the president to really push that and get some legislation through. And that's one thing that I think she just hasn't gotten enough attention for. And the same thing as Eleanor, when she was writing her books, she did 2 books, one when she was second lady with the dog, talking about what it was like to be living with the vice president, then Millie's book, which was Life in the White House Through the Dog's Eyes. Millions of dollars, and every penny of that went to her foundation.
Yeah, Millie's book was really the financial basis for the founding of the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy.
Yeah, and you mentioned Laura and Afghan women. Laura Bush did something that no other First Lady has done, and this goes back to radio. The president does a radio address every Saturday. I don't know how many people actually listen to it, but they do it. And she is the only First Lady who gave the presidential radio address. And it was right before Thanksgiving in 2001, after 9/11. And she talked about what the Taliban had been doing to women and why it was so important for us to liberate the country from the Taliban, and brought to our attention a lot of what was being done. And she and Hillary Clinton have been and Madeleine Albright have been involved with the Afghan Women's Council, and they have helped get a lot of women out of Afghanistan since the fall. So I think that's been a really important part of her legacy,
and
too.
It continues.
Yeah, very good question.
She's still raising money for Afghan women.
Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yes. Yes. Hi. Yeah, over here, front row. I'm really loud. Well, it's good for people with the hearing loop.
Is it on? Recently, I happened on a wonderful discussion that Doris Kearns Goodwin had with Barbara and Laura Bush.
Oh.
And I was so impressed with the camaraderie between those two women. But one of the things they talked about was the tour that an outgoing First Lady gives to the incoming First Lady, and that bond, that continuity.
Yeah.
And I noticed that it stopped recently because,
Yes, it did.
a certain First Lady did not give it to Dr. Biden.
Yeah.
But that bond that has gone on since at least Mamie Eisenhower,
Yeah.
and speak to that continuity from one First Lady to the next. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure when that actually started. I think it may have predated Mamie Eisenhower, but I'm not.
Did Bess do
Did
it
Bess-
for Mamie? Because Bess
Bess
and Mamie
may-
were really
yeah,
good friends.
They were
Yeah, they
good
took
friends.
like
Yeah, they got
Spanish
along well.
classes. Yeah, they were friends.
Both women of the plains.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, Jacqueline Kennedy did not enjoy the tour because she had just given birth to
Oh, yes.
John Kennedy Jr. She had had a cesarean, and she had actually requested a wheelchair, and Mamie Eisenhower, for whatever reason, said to the White House staff, well, put it behind, I don't know, a door or something that shielded it. She felt that it didn't look right. And if Mrs. Kennedy requests it, then we'll give it to her. Well, Jacqueline Kennedy, I guess, felt embarrassed. She didn't. And then afterwards, Mrs. Kennedy said, that took so much out of me, it took me 3 days to recover from walking around the White House with her. But you're right about, for the most part, the camaraderie. I remember reading after Hillary Clinton gave Laura Bush her tour of the White House, the two of them really, they understood each other. So they're all part of a very small and very select sorority, if you will. And, when I interviewed Betty Ford, she said, we had been in national politics for years. There was nothing that prepared me for the White House. I just recalled, Jacqueline Kennedy, did she give Lady Bird a tour?
This was
long
amazing.
note.
3 days after the funeral, Lady Bird had, Jackie Kennedy asked to see she was still in the White House and asked Lady Bird to come to see her. She had written a 7-page memo in longhand on legal pad for Lady Bird, asking her a favor, and it was to continue her work with the restoration of the White House. And Myra had mentioned, since Jackie, every First Lady has had a cause, and Lady Bird had the environment. Right. But Lady Bird agreed to take that on. And that's the only time one First Lady has ever asked another First Lady to take something on, and Lady Bird did it. And then what people don't know also, Pat Nixon finished what Jackie Kennedy started. In fact, she brought in twice as many artifacts as Jackie did. She put ramps in. This was before the ADA, before Bob Dole and the ADA, 20 years. She made it accessible. She had signers. She had the programs put in Braille. She had things done in multiple languages. She had tours at night for working people. She lit up the White House for the first time. But, this was also Lady Bird passing things along, to Pat Nixon. And the Grand Rapids event 40 years ago, it was Rosalind Carter and Betty Ford. It was at the Ford Library. But who did Gerald Ford lose to? Jimmy Carter. And those two women became fast friends. They appeared together in Congress as former First Ladies testifying on health care legislation and the importance for mental health. And when Nancy Reagan died, Michelle Obama said that Nancy Reagan had been an incredible mentor to her and that she had called her and given her advice and had helped her out. And it is a sisterhood that they put partisanship aside, just like the presidents do. Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush became good friends, and Barbara Bush referred to Bill Clinton as their, fifth son?
Fifth son?
Yeah. If you could have imagined that in 1992. There is this understanding that this is such an unusual role. There's no rule book. There's no constitutional authority. As Lady Bird Johnson said, the First Lady is elected by one person, her husband. And it's a tough road. So very good question. Thank you. We have time. There's another one over here, I think. Yeah, Ann?
I've been trying to figure out how to phrase this because I don't want to be disrespectful to anything that the First Ladies have done. But I wondered if you guys had any ideas about how the roles that the First Ladies have played may have either hindered or pushed forward the ultimate goal of having a first gentleman.
Oh. Okay. Well, I can
wanna
start that
start?
one. I think what Jill Biden has done has helped with that. She's continuing to work. And Doug Emhoff, as second gentleman, is working. And I really think when we have a first gentleman or whatever he's going to be called, I think that person will work. And so Jill Biden has shown, I doubt if that person is going to be too concerned about which China they're using or anything. There will be staff, but I think that's been an important piece. And the thing I always point out is that we've had, well, in Kansas, we're pretty unusual. We've had 3, women governors, and those husbands have done their own thing. And we have women governors all over the country, and I think we have a lot of models there. But I do think that what Jill Biden has done, some of what Eleanor Roosevelt did with some independence, what Betty Ford did, I think a lot of them have made it possible for whoever the spouse of the first woman president is to do his thing.
By the way, there was this thought that if Hillary Clinton had won the presidency in 2016, that we were going to call Bill Clinton the first laddie.
Yeah.
I would agree, though, with what Diana said. I think that all of the activist first ladies in particular, so Eleanor Roosevelt, even Lady Bird Johnson, Betty Ford, Rosalind Carter, certainly Hillary, have all laid the building blocks that are going to get us there, to that first female president. And I don't know who it's going to be. I thought it was going to be in my lifetime. I'm not so sure. I hope so. But there are going to be some unique challenges, and you're right about Dr. Biden. She's shown, yes, that you can work outside the home. And the 2 major issues that we'll have to deal with when we do have a female president, if her husband is working, is going to be security and the question of just went right out of my mind.
Conflict of interest, possibly?
No, issues, making sure that issues don't collide. But it's going to happen. I really am convinced it'll happen.
Yeah. Do we have one last question? Oh, Barbara has one. And then I think we will.
I want to give credit where credit's due when we talk about what first ladies have done. Laura Bush, and I read, you can verify if it's correct or not, that she left a letter for Michelle Obama, as well as each of her 2 daughters wrote to the 2 daughters of Obama. Would you talk about that?
Yes, that did happen. Laura Bush did leave the outgoing president always leaves a letter for the incoming president. And Laura Bush did leave a letter, and the daughters did write to, even though they were a lot older than the Obama, they were the Obama kids' ages when their grandparents were in the White House. And so those kids had spent a lot of time in the White House as grandchildren. And so they did leave letters for the Obama girls about kind of how to manage everything, which is, I think, just another, says a lot about Laura Bush. And once again, the Obamas and the Bushes have become close friends. There have been a lot of pictures of Michelle Obama and W, hugging and having a lot of fun together. And it's, so I think, that's just another thing, another example of the understanding that an outgoing president and first lady have for what their successors are going to be facing.
And I also just want to add to that, also the understanding, I don't know if anybody will remember this, but it's become now something that happens every November is that the president pardons the turkey, the Thanksgiving turkey, that happens. Well, the year that Obama did it, the girls were with him, and I guess the older, Sasha? Malia is the older girl. Malia was standing there just rolling her eyes, saying, "Oh, God, Dad, this is just awful, and I have to be here to be part of this." And Sasha was there. And I don't recall what she was wearing, but somebody on one of the Republican congressman's staff wrote something about the fact that she was dressed inappropriately. I got called about this, so that's why I remember it. And Laura Bush, bless her, said, for crying out loud, she's 13, give her a break. She's a kid. She's in the White House. I had children that age in the public eye. It's not easy. And I thought, it was just it was a really nice and friendly and genteel thing for Laura Bush to do. And I'm sure that Mrs. Obama really appreciated it.
Well, and Laura Bush did one other very, very gracious thing. During the 2008 campaign, when Michelle Obama made the comment about, for the first time, I am proud of my country, in my life, I'm proud of my country. And remember the brouhaha that created, that she was an angry black woman and, anti-American and everything. Do you know who spoke out in her defense?
Laura Bush.
Laura Bush. Laura Bush said, somebody asked her, what do you, as First Lady, should somebody who's likely to be First Lady be making comments like this? And she goes, I think, it's the heat of the campaign trail, basically. And she said, I think what she really meant to say is, I am proud of my country, again. But, and she really tried to say, this is what I think she was really saying. Leave her alone. And that was an incredibly gracious thing for Laura Bush to do.
It was.
Which, once again, says a lot about, she came out of a very middle-class family in Midland, Texas. And the thing about Laura Bush is, she still has 4 friends from Midland, one of whom we know, Barbara, who was a state senator in the state, and they continue to vacation together. They have ever since college. And Laura Bush is loyal to people, and I think that was an important quality why she was very successful. So, well, our time has come to an end. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And Myra, thank you.
Thank you, Diana.
Glad you finally got here.
Yeah, I'm so happy. Thank you.
And we'll be around if anybody wants any kind of informal chat, but thank you so much.